alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Hello and welcome to Alive After Reading. I'm Tim Niederreiter, and with me today is a new kind of guest for the program. A YouTube host, I suppose you might call him a YouTube... I don't host, maybe that's the wrong word. YouTube creator. Crimson Rogue, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's good to have you on. You do a variety of types of videos on YouTube. Mostly they're focused around books or stories. Books or movies, usually, right?
Books are the primary inspiration. A lot of what I do comes down to breaking down the story of a book or movie. I got started pretty much comparing books to movies, actually, literary adaptation. And I've since kind of branched off into doing all sorts of different things. Sometimes just looking at the movie, sometimes just straight book reviews. So it's a mishmash of both.
Yeah, I enjoy your channel, as I've said before the show, but I really do think there's a particular kind of video that you do that, I mean, there's a series, there are these really long book reviews generally about books that are kind of terrible or considered to be, they have like a reputation for being bad at the very least.
We're kind of jokingly calling that the Masochistic Tango series.
Ooh, nice.
The point of that is oftentimes some books have almost no redeeming qualities, and they serve as great examples of what not to do in writing. And sometimes they're just fun to poke fun at.
Oh, absolutely. I have a lot of fun with those. Those are my favorite ones. The other stuff I enjoy as well, but I think I guess the thing as a writer myself, I feel, and I know you write as well, but as a writer myself, it's a little controversial to me almost to feel the way I feel about those videos. Like, I like these so much, but on the other hand, it's something that if my book was to appear there, I'd be mortified. Of course, that's just any writer would be. But it's weird because there's almost this level of creator behaving badly behind most of these books as well, that you've covered so far in there.
To an extent, there is, yes.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, not behaving badly as in like a criminal, but so much as kind of not smart behavior as an author.
Yeah, there's enough controversy between some of these figures that I don't really need to go too much into detail about them.
Mm-hmm.
So far, every single author that I've gone after has some sort of reputation, or there's some sort of controversy behind what they're doing. For lack of a better word, cleanest author I've gone after is probably E.L. James, and that should tell you something.
It sure does. And so, but one of those in particular has kind of drawn my interest toward your, and I'm not embarrassed to say it, though it is a little weird to say it, but there's one particular review you did. It's a two-parter, but that I've actually listened to a bunch. You only watch it the one time because then I just have it on in the background sometimes. It's kind of weird to say, but it's because I find it just such a fascinating thing to think about, which is this book that I'm never going to read. Reaper's Creek was the title of the book.
Yes.
But it's just such, your coverage of it made me very interested in the particular genre that it is a part of, because there is a genre there to that one. And that's kind of anyway. Go on. What do you think about that?
I was going to say, I suppose if you want to be generous, you can say that it could fall into some sort of a genre. The book itself is such a mess that I'm honestly not sure how to qualify it. Like outside of some sort of a broad male power fantasy sort of a label.
That's more or less where I was going to go with it. But I mean, so I think that's the kind of level of genre I was thinking, more of the category of what it would interest someone. But of course, this book is so frankly awful that it probably, I'm not encouraging anyone to go and read it unless they want to lose some sanity.
Do not read this book. I took that hit so people didn't have to.
Exactly. I'd more say people should check out your videos series on that one. because I think that's fascinating, and maybe that's one of the reasons I feel like I feel like I got a different. I obviously got a very different experience of that book than you did, because you actually read it, and I just simply got a fairly entertaining, coverage of the book, which is, it's more fun than reading the book. I'm sure that's what I'm trying to say.
Well, I can only imagine you had more fun than I did.
Well, isn't that the point? I mean, it works. You did a good job, But I guess my point is that that to me, this power fantasy element, especially, it kind of rolls in with some other independent, especially books that I've read recently, which are the kind of, I think the category, there isn't a category for it on Amazon. It's not an official subgenre, but I think of it as kind of empire building or superpowers, basically superheroes without the heroics necessarily in a lot of cases.
I think I know
yeah.
what you're talking about.
Yeah, there's a couple. I've actually interviewed a couple, and it can come in all sorts of broader or more traditional genres. There's science fiction versions of it. There's fantasy versions, but the most prominent ones I've noticed are ones that are kind of like a blend of both, but usually they start in the modern world. This is things like Michael Anderle, who again I has been a guest in the show, and his first book is rough because it was his first book ever, but it is still pretty emblematic of this genre or this category, which is of interest to me because then he's got this huge empire that he built off of it in real life as an author in that case. Anyway, that's enough about me and that. I was going to ask, do you think that the male power fantasy has inherent flaws to it, this power fantasy empire building kind of thing? Is that kind of always going to be a flaw for some readers? I mean, I guess not for some readers, but of course it will for some readers. That's kind of obvious. But is it always going to be kind of make the story less significant to have a power fantasy element, or is that just not necessary?
Well, I've got kind of two minds about this. The first one is the concept of the male power fantasy itself. I do think that there is room for that kind of a story if it's told right. That pretty much defines the 80s cinema in one go. You do have layers in storytelling. You've got like the surface layer meaning, and then you've got kind of a deeper subtextual subjective viewpoint of what certain things mean, and then there's a deeper interpretation or thematic element that you're going for. Typically, the male power fantasy is going to be only that surface level kind of a story. It's not going to be about how one retired colonel's journey to rediscover himself led him back onto the battlefield or something like that. Or if that movie does exist, I haven't seen it. Take the recent remake of A-Team, for example. That movie, or anything by Michael Bay, really. But A-Team was pretty much, look at how awesome these fight scenes are. Look at how this awesome action scene, this ridiculous combat. It is 10 kinds of crazy. And I absolutely love that movie. It is a shameless explosion fest. There is no depth to it at all. And it's still fun. It doesn't have to have a deeper meaning if it is still told in an enjoyable way. And I would argue that it is. On the other hand, though, the idea of a male power fantasy, and a video that recently came out that I would recommend for deeper analysis of this is Literature Devil's Superman video. I'm forgetting the exact title, but it was actually a very good analytical piece on the importance of Superman and the complexity of the hero archetype. But the kind of thing that Onision was going for in Reaper's Creek was, here's my main character. He's so very powerful. Isn't that awesome?
Right.
That's awful. He doesn't have anything to really challenge him out. There's no conflict that really means anything in that book because he's never faced with any kind of confrontation that has any lasting consequences. His girlfriend gets shot in the head, and he revives her like 10 seconds later, like from death. It's like,
right. How can there be anything to challenge a character after something like that? Yeah.
No, and there's, because of that, because there's no tension, there's no real interest in the story. There's nothing for the reader to sit on the edge of their seat. Oh my God, is the hero going to make it out okay? Contrast to that, you've got a character like Superman, who actually does, if he doesn't, let me back up a little bit. If
Sure.
he had a story, like an hour and a half long movie of Superman, and the only thing he did was walk all over bank robbers all day, that movie would be terrible. However, if he were to go up and face enemies that were equal to or greater than him, okay, there's something you can invest yourself with there. There's actually some conflict there because he's actually struggling. You don't get that with Reaper's Creek at all, at any point.
Yeah, I guess the thing I find interesting when I hear from that book is the potential that what if something had happened that had challenged the guy, after some of these overpowered moments, and then like, oh man, that'd be so cool if something put him in his place right now, because then, the protagonist would suddenly become much more interesting because he would have to adapt compared to how that's what I'm saying there. Yeah.
Yes, I mean the very concept of an overpowered character like that can work if they're done well. They either need to go against an equal or greater force, or the story has to be about an internal struggle. I did the same thing with my own overpowered character in my novella, Micro God. Not the greatest work. I can write better than that now, I promise you. But,
that early works. Sorry, what did you say? Sorry.
The point of Micro God was not about how impressive the protagonist was. It was about how even with all of these powers, there were still things that he couldn't save. There were still limits to what he could actually do. And the exercise that I had for myself was trying to go through and make the protagonist at least somewhat sympathetic. And I'll leave that up to other people to decide if I succeeded or not. But I think I did an all right job.
Yeah, cool. I actually think that's a good point, because it's funny. I had a conversation with a friend of mine recently. Or I mentioned we were talking about one of my books, and I mentioned how the one character could make things. He could basically make anything he touched light as a feather. I mean, up to a certain size, whatever. He's got limitations, but he's not that powerful. It sounds like your character from Micro God has more wide-ranging abilities, for example. But then what my friend said is like, well, that guy sounds really overpowered. I'm like, well, I looked at my setting and I'm like, that guy's kind of a piker compared to a lot of other guys setting and what they can do. So it's that kind of thing, in fantasy worlds, science fiction settings, these can have vast differences in character power.
And that's the great thing about fantasy. You have such versatility and variety with magic systems. Just a fleeting glance at Brandon Sanderson proved that alone. Absolutely. Sanderson. The thing is about Sanderson is interesting is actually I think his books, because I have read a fair few of them. Or at one point it was a fair few. Now I've kind of fallen behind. But with like Mistborn or the first. What is it? First Storm. Geez, I'm looking at the first of his big series, Stormlight Archive. That's the one. Yeah, right. The Way of Kings is the first book. These books are more. The Way of Kings is actually the one where it's like it feels a little grittier in a way, even though it's not in a dying world or anything necessarily. But to me it felt grittier because the main character doesn't understand that he has this, one of the main characters at least, the one who's like going through all this terrible suffering for most of the book, doesn't realize he has superpowers really, or he has magic in his command. For a lot of it, he doesn't, and he can't. Like it's all but the things he can't do and the things he failed to do, and that's one of the reasons that book really resonates with me compared to just a lot of other books out there that are not as striking in that regard. There's definitely a lot more you can do with an underdog character than whatever the opposite with the Ubermensch.
Yeah, Ubermensch. Ubermensch is also another interesting one because then you take away effectively the emotional conflict by making them almost like a killer robot. If you take that kind of Nietzschean approach to it, where they're not. Alan Moore did this very well in some of his comics, especially Miracle Man, or it was Marvel Man when it was first published, I think. But that is a long time ago, so we'll just go with Miracle Man. The guy's anyway. Definitely check that out if you're interested in gritty comics, people. But anyway, as far as overpowered though, that's the thing I want to ask you about. What do you think the problems do you think there are good ways to do overpowered characters that focus on the power, or is it more that the limitations always have to be center stage?
It's not necessarily that the limitations have to be center stage, but it really depends on what the conflict of the story is going to be. What are you wanting to say with the story? If the antagonist is going to be external, then you've got to have. Well, I mean that's closer to a proper story in and of itself. If you're internal, then you've got to have a lot of introspection with the protagonist, and you've got to have you've got to tread very carefully to make sure that you don't rely on a lot of bad writing tropes in order to get yourself out of whatever trouble winds up in the books. Like the main character, let's just say Superman, decides to be evil randomly one day and take over the planet, and then this little dying puppy just looks up at him really sad after he levels a city, and Superman's like, "Oh no, I've been evil the whole time," and then just stops. I mean, that'd be an awful story.
Yeah, that'd be awful. Maybe if Superman kills himself at the end, like a Shakespearean tragedy or whatever, or Greek tragedy, that might make more sense as a story. But yeah, it'd still probably piss a lot of people off, obviously, especially in the comic book world. And if you're talking about actual Superman and not just a Superman-esque character,
they've suffered enough with one more day.
Yeah. We don't need to throw any more punches at DC here. Yeah. So I think that's a good point, because it's all about how the character, like you say, how the character is either opposed by a force that is either equal to them or just inversely power. Like say they're up against someone that their powers just can't help them against, for example. And this could be something that takes away their powers, right? Or it could be someone they just don't want to use their powers against, for example, something like that. Or someone who's like the conflict just isn't power related is the thing,
I think that would be. I'm getting to the point in my own analytical career, for lack of a better word, where I'm starting to get much more interested in that internal struggle, where it's not a matter of Dragon Ball Z styled powers, like who can punch the other one the hardest. But like when you've got matters of philosophy, when the bad guy's evil plan isn't necessarily as evil as it could be. It's like, it's not necessarily take over the entire world because I want power. It's take over the world because I've got this new system of government that I want to try, and I can bring world peace through it.
Yeah. No, so adding some depth, some controversy, basically, to the positions. They're not always. It's not pure good versus pure evil. It's not Superman versus something. I mean, versus Lex Luthor maybe, but Lex Luthor even would be a grayer character than some of the Superman villains out there.
I've always found villains are much more interesting when you can understand why they would think themselves the good guys in their own story.
Yeah,
they could be terrible, but if you don't write them in the right kind of way, where you can understand why they are the way that they are. If they're not like a classic Dick Dastardly mustache twirling bad guy who just ties damsels to railroad tracks because it's Tuesday and bored. But if he's like actually out there trying to gain something or improve something, possibly because of some warped interpretation of understanding of things, then the story is going to be much richer for it.
Right. I think I get that. I should get it. I've written a ton of books, and I had focused on the villain a lot in my early fiction, and lately I've focused on villains less, which is, I think, to my own detriment, honestly, and the detriment of my stories, at least my enjoyment of writing them, because I've always loved villains like that, and I think having a villain that's got a lot of, not necessarily physical power, but a lot of emotional or story weight to them is really, really enjoyable to write, personally. And I hope it would come across well to readers, too. I think it makes the story more interesting, but I also just appreciate it for its own sake,
Agreed. That way you can at least get some kind of emotional investment as a reader, even if you don't agree with the philosophy.
Yeah, and I mean that's one of the reasons. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of Marvel movies, but I still think I liked Infinity War because of the villain thing and because of the way they pitched this as the villain. And granted, I mean, there's all those essays and stuff now about his plan really is pretty dumb, and I agree. At least in the movie, it really doesn't make a lot of sense. People will just make more people. That's how it works. But anyway, it's one of those things that if you look at a character like Thanos and you treat him like he's the hero of his own story, and that's very much what that movie does, it makes this character that is basically a mustache twirling villain in a lot of ways much more sympathetic and interesting. But that movie also he's like the main character of that movie to some degree too, which is kind of interesting. And I don't think most stories are going to necessarily go that route with the villain, but there's definitely ways, without getting into the villain's head even, that you can show that they're not 100%, Snidely Whiplash or whatever.
Right.
What would you say, though, that if a story, and okay, this is kind of where it becomes interesting, if a story is kind of about the main character gaining a power, like taking over the world, maybe not deliberately, because that is what a good number of these stories involve, building like galactic empires and stuff, at least in the indie space. And I find that interesting because I'm not sure how to imagine a setting like that doesn't just feel like crazy wish fulfillment. A story like that. Do you think that kind of story has real benefits to readers other than the heavy wish fulfillment element? Do you think that, what do you think about that sort of thing?
Well, you've got the classic fallback theme of just displaying the corruption of power.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was an Abe Lincoln quote: if you want to really test a man's mettle, give him power, or something like that. But there's definitely something to be explored with the growth of a character. Oftentimes, people will consider character arc as a character moving in a positive direction, and actually have a story idea where I want to do exactly the opposite. Oftentimes, characters do go through in some sort of episodic nature and learn the importance of friendship and sharing, or whatever the lesson happens to be. But just as easily, they could be corrupted over time through whatever influence. They could be affected and changed by the events around them. For some reason, the example that's coming to mind right now is Handsome Jack from the Borderlands video game series. Because if you actually go through, I believe it was the pre-sequel, you get to see his story as he rose from basically a nothing in his company to being the head CEO, megalomaniacal madman.
Yeah, that classic archetype. That also makes that's great though. That sounds like a really fun story element. And then there's also the element of I've been thinking about this a lot, because I think the next book in my big fantasy series, my Demon Hunter series, is going to involve kind of the direction of disintegration, is kind of how I think of it, where the character gets worse instead of increasing in either morally effectiveness or physical effectiveness, and having the character kind of either. And I also love the idea of doing the inverted scale, which is that the character attains more physical power and loses some of their moral kind of clarity or power as a result, their goodness maybe, so they get corrupted by it. I think that's a really interesting story in its own right.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I've done some research for a very similar novel myself, actually, basing off the work of Lawrence Kohlberg.
So what kind of a story? I'm actually not familiar with Kohlberg. What sort of work did Kohlberg do?
Kohlberg actually did the 6 stages of moral development psychology. Basically, you've got 3 sets of pairs that most people are supposed to go through, and I've used this to analyze characters before. Empress Teresa specifically actually mentioned that in the review part 2, I believe, but I don't know off the top of my head.
There's a lot of video there in that series in particular. There's a ton to see, so probably why I forgot it. But yeah, okay.
But what the steps do is you go through pre-developmental, developmental, and post-developmental stages, which display where people typically fall and, generally speaking, what ages they would fall under. And you've got like the "what's in it for me" stage, like you're good because if you do the dishes, you'll get a piece of candy, or your parents will pay an allowance, or something like that. Or you've got the morality and the law stage. I believe that's stage 3, where you don't break the law, not because it's the wrong thing to do, but because if you break the law, you're going to get arrested.
Mm-hmm. So you're afraid of punishment. Yeah.
Exactly. And I've found that was a fascinating model to try to study and understand moral development in a character. Why would they think certain things? Why would they internally justify certain heinous actions? Is it because they're entirely without moral, or is it because they have a warped perspective of morals?
Right. Yeah. And then there's the other element of how that manifests in their life. Because do they become self-destructive, or do they simply become kind of the supervillain archetype to some degree, where they're just grasping and they can sacrifice other people and such if they as they get worse and they diminish in their ability, or they just simply become. I almost think it'd be interesting too, depending on the kind of story, to see like, oh, this character doesn't appear to change that much on the outside, but you can see on the inside they're like, they're hurting, or their morality is more simple, or less developed effectively than it would be before. It moves down the stages instead of up them. Yeah.
Yes. So I mean, I think that it would be really fun to instead of watching someone try to develop morally through some sort of a certain problem, take a moral character and run him backwards instead of development, and watch his character degrade as he gets worse and worse.
Yeah, because there's nothing worse than a character that's kind of right all the time. There was this one line I remember from an anime. It was like, it wasn't me that was wrong, it was the world, I think is how it translates, or it was in the dub. And that is hilarious to me, because it's always the line I go to when I'm thinking, well, that's a weird thing to say. I mean, honestly. But it's also this kind of intensely self-righteous kind of vibe that I think is interesting in its own right, but also very, I consider it fairly weak writing, in that if that's actually true, then it becomes the main character just knows everything, and he's this smart ass who's in charge and also right about everything, And
that is where a lot of people unfortunately stumble in their own writing, because they are afraid of making the main character unsympathetic or unrelatable, when really the best characters are the ones with flaws. One piece of advice that I'll give people trying to write is don't be afraid of making your character human. They're going to mess up. They're going to have flaws. And if you forget to write them in, or if you give them something that's like a flaw that's entirely superficial, like they're clumsy, then you wind up with Bella Swan.
Yeah, the perennial favorite flaw of the clumsy person, who just doesn't know how beautiful they are or whatever. Yeah, that makes so much sense. I'd second that one. I think making it's not even about not be. It's even more so than that. I'd almost say the thing that you should worry about, if you should worry about anything in writing, is making your character not human. But I would also say you shouldn't worry about too much when you're writing, because that's not helpful for writing, for the writing process itself. I mean, in rough draft, you can do that when you're editing.
Editing is so crucial.
Extremely so, and not just cleaning up, folks, because sometimes you're going to need to tweak things that are not just, the grammar here was bad. Sometimes your story doesn't make any sense on a structural level, and I say this from experience.
And I will second that. I'm writing a novel right now, and I am trying to storyboard everything for a 5-book series, and I am pairing up every minute detail that doesn't exactly work or won't lead to anything, or there is so much work to be done.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's even more important than the writing stage.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I was just talking about this last week with Joshua Pandaluresco, who was just on the show, and because I dictate my fiction now, and I'm a discovery writer, so even though we have different approaches, right, I put everything on the page, but then I tear a ton of it out, pretty much, is how I do my books. And
it's entire chapter, but sometimes it is essential for the good of the story.
Exactly. Or, that clever line. I mean, the clever lines you put in there that don't really work or they don't make sense, sometimes those got to go too. That's a classic Stephen King piece of advice as well. So, yeah, there's a little bit of writing advice to round things out. But, Krimson, it's been great having you on the show. Tell people where they can find you and your work, your YouTube and such.
The easiest place to find me would be on YouTube. The channel name is going to be Krimson Rogue. That's Krimson with a K. I'm also on Twitter at Krimson Rogue, again with a K, and Facebook, KRM, The Book Was Better.
Nice. Thanks for being on the show once again. And I think it's been a good conversation. I've enjoyed it. So as for this podcast, you can find us at mentalcellarpublications.com. You can read my books. You can't listen to them. Sorry, guys. Audiobooks are expensive. Gotta get more profit before I can make audiobooks. But, yeah, you can read my books on Amazon.com. Currently, Shadow Prince is out there. That's big fantasy with a murder mystery plot in it. And yeah, thanks for listening, everybody. And I'll talk to you next week.
That tears it.